Sorry, I just stole your thunder, Karina. Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in just a second, seeing if anybody else is trickling in. You see, though, that anybody else in the waiting room? Nope. All right, well, I'll get started with our introductions. I am going to be moderating today, but I know Kate's going to be kind of running the show. So welcome to Localizing Climate Change through Place-Based Relationships, emphasis on water's role. I'll just say that one more time because I know like several people just joined us, but welcome to Localizing Climate Change through Place-Based Relationships, water's role. My name's Erin. I'll be moderating today, but I know this is going to be a more engaging, kind of hands-on session. So I'll let Kate's going to be driving. So Kate Flick is our session presenter and host. Kate is passionate about place-based education that values different ways of knowing and learning. She engages in biocultural stewardship principles and gets people outside learning from the fascinating world around them. Kate works as a sustainable forestry education outreach specialist with LEAF, the Wisconsin K-12 forestry education program, and more recently as a geoscience faculty with the College of Menominee Nation. And Kate's also finishing up her PhD in natural resource science and management at the University of Minnesota, and has recently been exploring how to use storylines and observations as a tool to localize climate change through ecocultural calendars. She especially loves the lakes, water, and forests of Wisconsin, and some of her favorite forests throughout the world include Menominee Nation's forest, Black Forest in Southwest Germany, coastal redwoods, California, Van Cortlandt Park, Bronx, New York, River Pines, Green Circle Trail. I feel like I'm like, oh, I want to go all these places. And Stevens Point, of course. But a cottonwood forest along the lakeshore is what first grabbed her attention in a forestry sense. So thank you all for joining us. And Kate, I'll let you take it away.
All right. I told you to cut that intro. It was a little bit long. So anyway,
sorry, we did the whole thing.
Well, then I don't have to, you all know who I am, who's ever here. Is my screen sharing now? Just to make sure.
Yes,
okay.
It is. I don't know if you want to put it in, oh, there you go, presenter mode,
Yep,
but
that mode.
You can see it perfectly.
Cool. All right, so anyway, thanks everyone for coming. And yeah, I'm excited to do this today. And before we get doing anything, actually, since I had a good intro, I'm just gonna go on to the next thing. So Achtung, sometimes I'll switch into different languages. I'm just adjusting where my stuff is on there. But anyway, we're in this Zoom world, and I was just talking to my advisor, and she was talking about Zoom fatigue and how it's real. And this is a conference and it's totally loaded with stuff. So everyone should turn off their cameras and mics, and then we're all starting from the same place. But I want to normalize that you can turn your cameras and mics back on, because this is kind of a long session. And I'm trying to make it a little bit more interactive. So anyway, I just think we should all stand up and shake it out and wiggle it out and take some time to do that, because you've probably been doing conference and it's conference fatigue. And then I was also, one of the hats that I'm wearing during this presentation is that I work with LEAF, which is K-12 forestry education. And so anyway, I was just talking to, or I was just at this conference on how arts can be a formative assessment tool and how to integrate arts into our ways of teaching and learning as like the formative thing. And the lady was talking, she was a teacher doing it, and she was talking about a wiggle bee dance. But she had mentioned like doing arts as like an add-on or hitch on. And I asked her like, what did that mean? And she's like, well, I used to teach like, you know, ecology, and it would be the bee dance, and you know, they would make up a bee dance, and that was it. And so it was an add-on. But if you use arts as an assessment and a way of expressing yourself, then it can be what the thing is. And so you could ask them like, oh, why are you wiggling your left arm and your left leg right now, Kate? And then you'd have to explain like, well, the flower's over there and that's the direction. So anyway, that's my intro. And hopefully you all actually stood up and did some Zoom fatigue wiggles let out. Yeah, so that's I'm going to awkwardly transition now to a more formal presentation. But one of the other hats that I'm wearing is that I'm working on my PhD in natural resource science and management. So you're going to get some like theoretical mumbo jumbo, and I'm going to just, I'll try and keep it short, but you'll get a little bit of that. But then we're going to do some place mapping activities. And maybe we'll do some small groups, but I think we're kind of well, we're at 19 now. So we'll see how big we are and how things flow, if we're gonna do just large group discussion or outside or break into small groups. I need to take a sip of water actually from my wiggle it out dance. And I'm a little nervous in virtual format. And then we might do we're gonna do some outside stuff. So you'll get to go outside because that's like the most exciting part of this whole presentation, and it's really nice out and spring is here. So one thing I wanted to do just to start us off to normalize that we can chat and use the chat function. So I'm pulling up my chat here. And I wanted to look at my abstract and make sure I was doing what I said I was going to do, because I'm working on my PhD and I'm teaching. And so I have all these ideas in my head, but this is from the abstract. And I just wanted to say, everyone can respond in the chat. So true or false, climate change impacts us all. That was the first sentence of this presentation. And then I thought that might be a little boring. So go ahead and put in how it might do that too to the chat. All right, so we're getting some trues, heavy rains in northern Wisconsin, clean water. And you can keep on using the chat, so I'm encouraging you to do that. And then the second thing that I said is climate change can be informed by many ways of knowing. Let me move my view. However, it often remains an abstract concept that remains distant or controversial. So that's another thing we're kind of gonna think about today. So what do you think abstract means in a climate change sense? And as you can see, we're gonna be talking about climate change today. So, and thanks, there's more like flooding stuff in the chat, food security, warmer, 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 harder for trout. All right, so we're getting to some species. Awesome. And then another thing that I said we talk about is climate change as a way to ground in place and justice in order to mobilize and empower diverse ways of knowing in place. So that's something that I think is important, and it's going to be kind of fused throughout. And then we're going to actually get to do some practice, which is another thing that is cool. We get to think about wheels of time. And one of the aspects of my PhD is thinking about ecocultural calendars, but they're really great learning tools for everyone. And maybe now that we got the chat rolling, we can also have everyone introduce themselves and say who you are and where you're from. And then that can be a way of grounding in how we might think about ecocultural calendars and our places and communities, so that we can think about climate change as something that's local. So that's kind of a whirlwind introduction. And this is me breaking down some of the stuff that we're talking about, which I won't do as explicitly later on. But just the idea that climate change impacts us all and can be informed by many ways of knowing. However, it often remains an abstract concept that remains distant or controversial. And we had converted this camper to an audio recording studio and then asked people what they notice changing about the seasons and cycles. And one of the main ideas of this presentation is that climate science and climate change can be inclusionary knowledge systems. And they can be place-based. And so just kind of think about that as we're going through. And I wanted to play a little clip of how this translates out to ecocultural calendars that we're gonna eventually be doing, but this is what it sounded like in the camper.
Climate change. Societal grand challenge, controversy, extreme weather, warming temperatures. It's one of those concepts that gets a little bit hairy and can be hard to understand or make sense of. Often, at best, it's something science tells us is happening. Maybe something that makes sense in an abstract kind of way in a galaxy far, far away, or something that brings up an iconic image of a polar bear slipping into the ocean off the last chunk of ice. But in this project, we were really interested in understanding how people were experiencing and understanding climate change when they thought about it as a local phenomenon.
All right, so that gives you the picture. And this is just a general intro to give you an idea of where we're going. I kind of sped through a bunch of stuff right there. But we're going to be thinking about climate change and climate science as something that we can all practice. And I think we're mostly a water audience. And so it'll be interesting to think about this in relationship to water.
Climate change.
Oops, that's not what I want to do. And one of the reasons that I think this is important is that this is some of the theoretical mumbo jumbo. So I'm going to speed through this and you can ask questions about it later. But as we think about climate science, we exist within a kind of academic and way of knowing fortress. That sort of looks like the picture you can see with one tree growing out of it, and that's a climate change tree. And maybe you have some ecological science and some social science and soils and atmospheric sciences all on different branches, but they're kind of working in separate worlds. And then when we look at all the ideas that could exist about climate change, to get into that kind of Western science way of knowing, you have to go through a bunch of hoops, and it's a sort of fortress. But if you look at all the different ways of knowing, there's a whole forest out there, and probably climate change is something that we need lots of different ways to understand and be able to do something about. So that's the academic mumbo jumbo, and I think that's, when we did the interviews, just to give you an idea, because we're gonna be starting to make an ecocultural calendar, there was, I think, about 400 interviews that we had, and just analyzing those interviews on what people observed about change. This is kind of how it broke down noticing things. So you had seasonal rounds in your place, and then you could think about activities done regularly or plant and animals changing, both in terms of their composition and their phenology. But this is the like more nuanced, way big picture, and I just wanted to have you put it into your thinking caps for later. And when we're going to be thinking about ecological calendars and ecocultural calendars and how you might use these as tools with whoever you work with or just yourself, this is how the academic lens kind of looks at them, which this is a pretty fancy one, but just notice all the different stuff that the folks in place-based knowledge systems are observing. So there's constellations, there's seasons. This is in the Amazon. So that's like, we, think about 4 seasons. That's a pretty crazy amount of seasonal stuff. Precipitation, and then we have river levels going around. So there's lots of different ways to think about how this works. This is one from the Walpiri people out in Australia, and there and the gray around the circle, they kind of break things down seasonally, and they use their own language to kind of translate that place. So Wantanga, I don't know how to say it, means hot season, but you can see that those descriptors, green season, heavy rain, westerly wind season, hot rains with thunderstorms and lightning, heat haze, whirlwinds, is pretty descriptive in terms of thinking about place and how we might think about place and time, and what that means in a changing landscape. And then we have plant and animal happenings, and these are kind of in the center there. And those are in Indigenous contexts, which is most prevalent where you get ecological calendars and ecocultural calendars in academia. They're livelihood dependent. And so those are just a few examples. But in K-12 settings, Wheels of Time is another way of picturing like how we might think about ecocultural calendars when I make you do some stuff in relation to it. And this is the big question that hopefully we'll get to, and we'll break it down into little parts. But just to kind of give you a portrait of where we're going and how you might think about an ecological calendar. These ones are all circular, but as we saw in that Brazilian example, it doesn't need to be circular. So I just would like you to say, get creative. Okay, we're almost done with like the big talking part, and then we're gonna like actually do some stuff and be more interactive. So start getting ready. But before we do that, I just want to give a little Indigenous land acknowledgement. I work at UWSP with LEAF and the Wisconsin Center for Environmental Ed, and there at UWSP, we're kind of on a crossing grounds of Ho-Chunk and Menominee nations. And just to note that Indigenous people have been, are, and will be taking care of the land for forever. And so it's important to do that kind of acknowledgement because, like, for example, I grew up about an hour away from Menominee Nation, where I later worked, and didn't even know they existed. So I just want to put in this little Indigenous land acknowledgement. And this is a more formal introduction to who I am, but all of you that are participating, you might find it useful that there's a lot of forestry education resources with the LEAF program. And you might be thinking, well, this is a water conference, but we are thinking a lot about the connections between healthy forests and healthy water. And so if that's something that you're interested in exploring more or have resources about, we did one workshop sometime before COVID hit, but hopefully we'll do some more. And with that, I really want to just get to the practice of ecocultural calendars and ecocultural calendar making. I just kind of hit you with a lot of stuff, so I'm just going to catch up on the chat and see if there's any questions so far. And take a sip of water while we're doing that. All right, so as we shift to thinking about this practice of ecocultural calendars and what that could look like for water, and thinking about climate change and water, and ultimately engaging people in climate change, because as we figured out in the very beginning, climate change is something that impacts us all. And so I really wanted to take a moment to ground in place, and particularly place thought. And this is a cool article. I'm just going to read out some of this quote, but it's from Watts, and it's this Indigenous place thought and agency amongst humans and non-humans. And she takes First Woman and Sky Woman, which she's Anishinaabe, and they go on like a European tour and kind of look at like how things are from an ecological lens. And so as we're grounding in place and for our next activity, it's necessary to tease out what the land's intentions might be and how she tries to speak through us. To be animate goes beyond being alive or acting. It is to be full of thought, desire, contemplation, and will. The agency that place possesses can be thought of in a similar way that Westerners locate agency in human beings. So that's like the biggest point, is that place is something that can speak through us. And so as we're thinking about climate change and water and people's relationships to those things, just ground in place thought. And so to do that, we're going to do our first activity. And generally for these activities, we might step away from the computer. We'll turn our audio and videos off. And then we'll come back at a specific time. And so that'll be the way that this kind of works. But for this first one, you'll need a pen and a paper at least. If you want to get more supplies, you can, to be artful and creative. But I just want you to draw an initial map and think about the place in which you live. The scale can be your choosing. So you can think about, okay, my yard, my city, my earth, You can do whatever scale you want, and we'll take about a minute or two. Let me see what time it is. So it's about 1:50 now, so we'll give you 2 minutes, 1:52, to do this. And I'm gonna turn off my screen. Does anyone have any questions before we send you off on drawing a placemat? And then hopefully some of you will be willing to share and talk about those. And to do that, you don't even have to turn your screen back on. You can just kind of turn your audio on. But if you want to, you can even hold up a thing and then share what your map looks like. So that's the directions. Last call for any questions. All right, so I'm going to turn my screen and audio off, and then we'll see you back in a couple minutes. All right, for folks that are just joining, or if you're doing a map, you can, or a place map, this is your 30-second warning. That's kind of a made up time, but sort of finish up what you're working on, and then I'll get back to things in a second here. All right, welcome back, everyone. Let me just get my chats and things up again. Cool, so this is the moment of truth. I'm trying to do participation in a Zoom fatigued world. So does anyone wanna share some of the stuff that they put on the map that they did of their place to ground in place? You can put it in the chat, you can unmute your audio and talk about it, or you can do the full Monty video display and show us what your map looks like.
I'll go full Monty, Kate.
All right, thanks. I was like, maybe my sound isn't turned on yet. Thanks for being the gateway person.
Yeah, you bet. Well, I don't think you'll be able to see my drawing very well here, but what I wanted to highlight, so I live in Duluth, Minnesota, right across from Superior, Wisconsin, and I just thought it was interesting. I didn't know what I was going to draw, and all that I ended up drawing was the water. I drew the lake, I drew the tributaries that come into the lake, I drew the St. Louis River, and that's all I got to, and I realized like those are the important orienting features that I immediately thought of.
Cool. Yeah, it's interesting that you're oriented to water. I wonder if that's because you work in water. You also live in a very water specific place. I guess, did anyone else relate to place through what they do or water in their map? Or have a totally different version of what their place map looks like and how they might begin grounding in place?
I'll share my map.
Awesome, thank you.
I guess I grounded in, my husband and I are organic vegetable farmers. So I don't know if you can see this. I sort of drew a picture of our farm, our greenhouses, and we're pumping water to all of our crops here. So this is all organic land. And then I have on the other side, there's a conventional farm. So I drew like a yuck face and a ear of corn. And then down the road from us is a class 1 trout stream, Camp Creek. So that's sort of my grounding. Is I'm always thinking about like we're growing organic and we're doing the best that we can to care for our land, but we have neighbors that are spraying and fertilizing and sending a lot of stuff down to our watershed. And we had our water tested and we're high nitrates and had to get a RO system, even though we're doing what we can to protect the land and water around us.
Yeah, so your map is representing like a whole bunch of things. I like how you went from the like specific plants and animals that you have like a very specific relationship with, and then kind of scaled it up to systems level landscapes and what that means. And so anyway, thank you for that. And like those are all really great layers and questions to think about as we're thinking about like these place-based maps and what does that climate change mean for our places as we're trying to translate it out as an expression of place. Do we have any other, so thank you so much, Joy. Do we have any other takers on folks that want to share their maps or thoughts about their maps?
I have a water one also. This is, well, now it's bleeding through the latest. So, but anyway, it's Upper Eau Claire Lake and we live right there on a point. And it's in Bayfield County. And so I orient to the lake too. Our waters have been very high from all the past few years. The groundwater is so high, and so our shorelines are washing away. And we were hoping, we got a Healthy Lakes grant, and we were hoping to put in some fish sticks this fall, you know, wood in the water, and we weren't able to because, or this spring, we weren't able to because the ice wasn't thick enough. So for the trucks, you know. Anyway, I orient with water. That's all I wanted to say. So thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing. And it's cool because water is something that's coming up again and again, probably because we're at a water conference. But as we think about ecocultural calendars and place, specifically place, water is such an important element that we can't live without. So I'm glad to be doing this like a little bit of experimental thought stuff with you all today in this water conference. Okay, so if everyone's okay with it, I'm gonna move on to the next thing, which as we're thinking about place and layers, so we have a couple different layers that we've been hearing about that you already have on your map. So we have like specific plants and animals, we have kind of the system level of landscape design, we have water kind of probably in various forms. So those are all different layers that we can think of as place-based stuff. But I just wanted to, I'm gonna read this passage. I was thinking of sending it as a PDF, but and having you mark it up and read it yourself, but that seems too complicated. So just kind of think about the maps that you just made, your place maps, and think about this concept of pentimiento, which is a concept actually in art, but it comes from this Indigenous scholar that I was reading, and he's talking about how there's a lot of layers of place, and we have a lot of layers that also get painted over when we think about place. And so what are those painted over layers that we might need to unlayer as we think about climate change and what that means for our places. So I'm just going to read this pretty quick, and let me pull up my chat again and just put into chat things that come up as you're thinking of this. And if there's layers and names on your map that you should add to your map or think about adding. So here goes. And this is from a book called Trace. And it's by Laurette Savoy, and it's kind of like an environmental history, but puts a lot of human perspectives on it. So that's a summary. And this is from a chapter called What's in a Name. Native place names, or the names of tribal people living in those places, began to appear on the 16th and 17th century European maps inlaid on the Atlantic coast. It might be better to say that explorers and colonists transcribed into familiar symbols what they heard. Indigenous sounds twisted on European, then Anglo-American tongues. Words and phrases were often reshaped with little sense of original context or use. Maps and journals then carried forward clipped words, simplified renderings, and translated sounds. Mutating steps could result in an English version of a French interpretation of an Indigenous word that ended up as Wisconsin. Woo woo, Wisconsin. That's part of the reason I picked this passage for you all. In misleading hand-drawn sketches, mapmakers and engravers in Europe created more errors. One changed letter, one formalized in print, could make a name of great meaning become meaningless. So I'm gonna say that again. One changed letter, once formalized in print, could make a name of great meaning become meaningless. So just think about that as we're thinking about layers of place, and probably lots of different place names that our place maps could have. More than half of the United States names originated in some form from Indigenous languages. Some began as records of tribal people encountered, either what they called themselves or what others called them: Dakota, Illini, Kansas, Ute. Some state names refer to specific elements of the landscape. Massachusetts to the Wampong means place of the foothill, but Puritan settlers used it for a bay in their colony. Kinetwick, not sure on pronunciation at all. The long tidal river became Connecticut. And there is the convoluted origin of the name Wisconsin. According to George Stewart, the French voyagers Jolette and Marquette heard and recorded Miscansing, or Miscansing, which starts with an M for those that can't see it, in 1673 for a river flowing west to the continental interior. But Miscansing became Oiskansing or Oiskonsink on later maps, finally Wisconsin in English. Anyway, it goes on and it kind of thinks about what names exist in places and what names don't exist, also more importantly, or what names might be mistranslations. So as we're thinking about climate change and knowledge and layers of place, I just kind of wanted to do this. And does anyone have any thoughts on names or place names that they might need to add to their map or might think about adding to a map? Or did you put any names on your original map?
I didn't put any names on my original map, but I'm sure the creek down below us, Camp Creek, it has not always been Camp Creek. I'm sure it had an Indigenous name before that. And I know for sure that we're in Ho-Chunk territory, so I would add that.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Cool. Well, even if you didn't have any like great philosophical moments, that's another thing that I wanted you to put your thinking cap on as we're talking about ecocultural calendars, which are just representations of different place-based senses of time. And let's see. So again, this is kind of what we're going to be thinking about. So what are ecocultural calendars and how do they connect to climate change? And this is something that's not really known or applied in lots of places. So there's no right answers. These are just a few examples that I've come across. And we're going to be working on and thinking about that. If you were all together in a workshop, I would have given you a bunch of art supplies. But we're just going to have a discussion about it a little bit later on. Does anyone have any questions so far? Also, just to catch up, because I know this is a long day, so I'm giving you a chance for another break, and we have a sort of big transition coming on. So I introduced some of the ecocultural examples, calendar examples, and then we started grounding in place. And so keep that place-based grounding on. Actually, let's go back to some of the, I'll show it. And you can think about what you want as the center, or what could be kind of how you would think about your ecocultural calendar. It sounds like water will be an important storyline in a lot of yours, but just start thinking about what that could look like. And one of the cool things about ecocultural calendars is that the way that we think about climate change is localized, and it's not something that's abstract. So in the interviews that I shared a clip of a little bit earlier on, a lot of people that we interviewed were like, yeah, climate change, it's polar bears, it's glaciers melting, it's something happening over there. Or maybe it's something that the news tells us is happening, or science tells us is happening, but we don't know exactly how it's happening. Or even if you have a place-based connection, like in Minnesota, they talk a lot about the moose, but a lot of people don't have those felt connections. So I really want you to ground as we're taking this break. Think about what are some things that you've noticed changing in the seasons and cycles. This is one of the big leading questions of this climate change stuff. And just take a moment as we're breaking, and really take a break to think about that, and maybe share some stories you have of things that you've noticed changing in the seasons and cycles when we get back. So it's just a break to take a break, because this is an 1.5-hour session. It's 2:06 right now. So let me see where I'm at on time. Hang on one sec. So let's take a 5-minute break. We'll have time for that. So it's let's be back at about 2:12-ish, and that's give or take. And please be willing to share some of the things that you've been thinking about. So with that, I'm gonna turn off my screen, and we'll see you back here at about 2:12, 2:15 at the latest. Any questions? Oops. All right, can I get a okay that I'm sounding good, okay, and things, and we're back? All right, I see some thumbs up and things like that, so welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your break, and normally if I do a workshop or something that was an hour and a half long, we'd probably take a break, so I figured we should too in this one. Did anyone have any, as you were thinking about things that you've noticed changing in the seasons and cycles, did anyone have any stories that they wanted to share as we're kind of shifting gears to connecting stories of change? You can put them in the chat or you can unmute yourself.
I wrote down a few things.
Cool. Thanks for being a game participant.
So as I said, I'm a farmer and I started keeping a daily journal a few years ago of recording just everything that goes on the farm, especially weather and climate patterns. And I've noticed just since 2017, we're planting earlier and harvesting later. So there's been an extension of the seasons. I've noted flooding and extreme rain events, different birds around. And also we recently changed to a no-till system. So even though I can't necessarily see that, I do see that we have healthier soil, but I also just know that we're sequestering more carbon compared to the neighboring farms that are tilling a lot of acreage. And the other note was different pests like Asian beetles coming on really strong at different times of the year.
Yeah, cool. So you're a really great person. If you were thinking about representing that on a kind of calendar or place time thing, what might be some things that you would keep track of, or maybe like different bird species when they arrive, or the timing, like how would you change the seasons?
Yeah, I think I would like kind of go by planting and harvest dates, are just kind of what comes to mind, because that is sort of how we mark our seasons. I've never really put it into a calendar, but I'm excited to sort of try that out, because so far I just have text or notes or just these data points.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. Anyone else have a story of change that they want to share? Otherwise, I'll show you an example. Oh, there's some in the chat about bird songs coming earlier and earlier, and house flies moving around, getting warmer. So different kind of seasonal noticings. I like the housefly one because that's something that everyone can relate to. And one of the things that's really cool about ecocultural calendars is that it's about your relationship to these different phenomenon that are happening. So here's a little clip of one person's observations and kind of ecocultural connections.
Okay. We've been doing some brainstorming, and I have this incredible memory of being a child and being outside at night and just the sky being lit up by the stars and then the field being lit up by fireflies, and just like everything that's romantic about like a warm summer night. And I noticed 2 summers ago when I was home visiting my mom that there were no fireflies. And I said something to her like, well, what's going on? Haven't you noticed this? And she's like, oh, no, I didn't notice it at all. And last summer, same thing, no fireflies. And we're actually staying with my parents right now. And maybe like 4 nights ago, I was outside and I saw one lone firefly.
All right. So that was just kind of a cute little story about this person's kind of ecocultural connection to fireflies. And as you think about making these connections to different people and ages and things like that, actually in the chat, has anyone noticed changes in fireflies? And then I just want to note that there's an intertribal climate change assessment that a bunch of tribes in Wisconsin and, well, the upper Great Lakes region with Gliffwick got together. And the firefly is one of the species that they kind of put on alert and have been noticing too. And so as we're thinking about climate change, really try and filter through some of those things that you've been observing and experiencing, whether it's just changes in weather or seasons or your activities are changing. I see in the chat ski season feels abbreviated, and then things in plants and animals that are going on. So with that, this is the coolest part because we get to go outside right now. And you might be thinking, well, we just had a break, but I gave you that break because I really want you to go outside and do this. So you have to pinky swear that you're going to do this. But as we're thinking about building these ecocultural connections and how we might keep track of them as on a place-based time calendar, let's just actually go out and practice connecting with a tree. So this is a thing that in my educator world, it's fun to do because you can, just go find a tree and then make a poem about it. If for some reason you're not able to go outside, feel free to just imagine an experience that you had with a tree. But if you are able to go outside, you'll need like a pen and a paper. You'll need to find a tree. And then I'm going to give you 10 whole minutes for this one because it's like, I think it's spring in Wisconsin, wherever you are, and it feels always really good to be outside in front of or not in front of a computer. So it's 2:18 now. So let's come back at about 2:30. And I really want you to go outside and just sit by that tree and then make a poem about it. And hopefully some of you will share some of your poems that you have. But this is step one, is actually just connecting and feeling with something. So focus your poem on that. Does anyone have any questions at all before we depart for our poem making adventure that gets to be outside?
When should we come back, Kate? Can you remind us?
Yeah, it's 2:18 now. So let's make it 2:30. That sounds pretty reasonable. Good question. All right. Then I will leave you all to go outside and make something for a tree, with a tree, and we'll be back at about 2:30. All right, so we're at about 2:30. There might still be some folks that are coming on in, but I'd like to, oh sweet, there's a poem that just came into the chat. Maple, sugar bush trees, we tap, we boil, we eat. Gratitude plus a sugar high, sweet treat. Awesome. Cool, how was that for everyone? Anyone want to share actually before I move along? Because I think it's nice to go outside, and if you have something that you want to share, which thanks Joy, feel free to put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and kind of talk about it.
I wrote one.
All right.
It's a, I don't know how to pronounce this, Sinquinin poem. I just butchered that, sorry.
That's okay, I don't know how to pronounce it either, so we'll just go with what you said.
Okay. Refuge, majestic oak, sanctuary offered, joyful play, sustenance, respite, haven.
Ah, very nice. I love all the senses of home and almost safety that you got from it.
Yeah, that's, I followed the pattern that it said. It told you exactly what to do, and I'm like, okay.
Yeah, sometimes rules are helpful.
Definitely. Thank
cool.
you.
And I see blue spruce standing tall, nourish and protect and grow. Narrow at my top, giver of life. Cool. All right. Well, I wanted to just share a couple of trees to kind of expand. So step number one is building these ecocultural connections. And when we think about kind of the Gregorian Western calendar and how it keeps track of time, it's a very placeless based of time. So there's no sense of place within it. And it's standardized, which is pretty useful because now we can all be here at one time. But if we think about all the different traditions of how we made sense of place and time throughout time, there's a lot of different ways to kind of think about and keep track of that are place-based senses of time. And really building these connections, even as simple as this was, where you just have to go and hang out with a tree for 10 minutes, is pretty important and pretty easy. And so I just wanted to share two tools quickly that exist that can help expand some of these connections. So this is the Climate Change Atlas, and I'm just going to click on this beach tree. And if you had a beach out there, let us know. But it's a really cool and simple tool. If you don't know it, you can see the current analysis. So there's a couple, beach isn't a super duper common species, kind of on that eastern side of the state there. But if you do any of these models that are projections, this is the high scenario. And so you can see that some of those habitats are shifting. So that's one tool. And then the other tool is the Wisconsin Community Tree Map. And this is something that for all you water folks, and you're bearing with me because I'm a forestry nerd, but trees and water are very connected. So I'm just going to show you this really cool tool that helps you value trees in a water sense too. So let me just get to the right organization. And so this is a tree map that we've been working with schools and educators. They can get access for free. There's a lot of townships and municipalities that also have it. But it basically allows you to add trees to your location. So I'm just going to add a tree and show you how simple it is. We'll just do it by GPS. Does anyone have an example tree that they want to stick in and see what kind of benefits the tree provides and shoots out? Karina, I know you had one. What was your tree again?
I just had a maple in my yard.
All right, let's put in a maple. And you don't really need to be that specific, so it's just a general species. And how big would you say the diameter? Big, little, small, medium?
It is huge. I feel like it's more than 2 feet. Let's say 2 feet though. Okay,
so let's give it a 24-inch diameter, which is huge. That's exciting. Those are the only things you need to put in. And then, oops, we're getting some time. Sorry, there's some things that are in my way here. And then you just X out. And it should have added a tree. Let's see. Oh, this is a different one. But anyway, we'll get the point because I want to leave time for discussion. But you can see all the cool ecological benefits. And so as you're thinking about these ecological connections that are really story-based, there are ways to connect it to quantified data. So this is a 10-inch, which isn't a very huge tree. It's probably about this big diameter. You can see that it's starting to calculate like runoff prevention in terms of gallons, property value, energy conservation. So I just wanted to share those two tools. And there is a test school and Tamarack 2018 password and login if you want to try out the tool yourself, and maybe there's some applications that you can see useful, or see if your organization's already involved. If someone can throw that into the chat, I think it's in the list of like links and stuff like that. And while you're doing that, I'm gonna just go back to my PowerPoint. Okay, so let's see, what time are we at here? 2:36. Okay, so we got about 20 minutes left. All right, so you made an ecocultural connection, blah, blah, blah. We went through that. And now we're at about 20 people. So let's try small group breakout rooms for these questions. And then we'll come back as a big group, but we'll give you about 5 minutes. And these are gonna be pretty broad, big questions. And so, think about ecocultural calendars in any way, shape, or form that you want. And I've been intentionally vague just to leave it up to you. You can think about what water's role is in there. You could define your seasonal round. So think about, in that Brazilian calendar, there was like 9 million different seasons. We generally go by the Gregorian, Western, winter, spring, summer, fall, but is that the best way to relate to climate change? And are those seasons changing? And then how would you integrate water into your calendars? So big, broad questions. Generally, you just want to think about how you would make an ecocultural calendar. And so, Karina, is it cool if we break into a small group chats, maybe with, actually, let's just skip the small group chat because I see people are kind of bailing on that. So let's skip that. We can do just a big group chat unless I get some pushback from folks. I'm still experimenting in this virtual world. Let's try it as a big group chat. So I guess just generally, what do you think about and how would you make a calendar? And
Hi, I think that it'd be cool to make a calendar where every day you make notations about what you observe in your yard and just see how that goes. And I've seen some really neat circular ones once at a workshop at the UW Arboretum, and where you could layer on things like moon phases and different kinds of temperature. You could just keep going out with the wheel with layers, but I think it would be cool to have that recorded because it's something I spend a lot of time looking out the window. Oh, how many cardinals in the yard or whatever, but to kind of remember exactly what time of year those birds come in. And I find myself doing that via photography now, like going back to an old album to see, oh yeah, about March 15th, I saw herons in nests at the rookery at Devil's Lake. I better go check them out. But to just be more, to do it visually and creatively would be really fun.
Yeah, I just put up, you might have gone, I know this Ann Forbes did these Wheels of Time and Janet Moore for a while in conjunction with probably Madison Arb folks.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, so you might be thinking of these kind of Wheels of Time. And yeah, you're right, just going out into your yard and paying attention and seeing. And as we interviewed people in backyard phenology, one of the really powerful ways to connect people to climate change was when they had a very specific memory that was tied to like a Gregorian Western calendar date, like Mother's Day shifting and May Day shifting were big ones. And then there'd be cute stories like, oh, we planted a cherry tree for my boyfriend's birthday 5 years ago, and now it blooms 2 weeks earlier and stuff. But because they had connected it to that specific time event, it was really cool to see how they could see those changes in place. So just kind of some reflections on your ideas, really cool.
Thanks.
I had one idea as I was just looking at these wheels of time, which would be like making multiple wheels and layering them on top of each other so that you could sort of line them up. Like if you did something like a monthly, like it broke it down into a monthly calendar, and you would have one that was like cultivated crops, one that was foraged crops, one that was constellations, one that was birds, one that was like waters or water levels or rivers, and then like make notes of that for the cycle of the year, and then be able to sort of like line them up and look at them in that layered fashion, I guess.
Yeah, I think that would be super cool. If I were going to do this workshop in an idealized way, I think we'd do some, and thinking about those layers of place and place, really expressing place's agency through these calendars. I would definitely take on that layer idea, because it is so cool. And then you could have like in my teacher hat, you could have like a whole class and everyone could, you know, take on a different element, and it'd be a really interesting picture of place. And there's always different data and things that you can link it to once you have those connections to think about climate change. So awesome, cool idea. I'll just go to some other examples too while we're hanging out here of those kind of wheels of time. But are there other thoughts and reflections? Oops, my chat went away, so let me pull that back up too.
I want to share with people that if you're looking for those layers of like indigenous inhabitation near your home, or that I'm working on a project now doing some research about Lake Mendota and Madison, and I have found that if there's a national historic site near you, like a historic neighborhood or whatever it is, and you go in and read that documentation at the National Park Service, they always have amazing archaeological and studies as they make the argument for a site. And I discovered that there was an Indian mound like a block from my house that I never even kind of conceptualized that space as a mound. So just a suggestion there.
Yeah, that was awesome. Sorry, I was paging through, but yes, historical society and thinking about those layers that are underrepresented is super awesome. And once you start digging, there's lots of great resources too. I know at UWSP, they've been finding that Old Main is built on some indigenous burial grounds in, it was a bunch of refugee status, it sounds like, indigenous folks, because points like a big crossing grounds, and there was a smallpox epidemic. And so like that's a whole layer of history that UWSP is working to kind of unlayer in that Pentimiento. And there's a lot of different places that you can go for resources for that. And if we're thinking about justice, it's really important to put that at the front and center. So thanks for sharing that. All right, well, I guess I'm gonna go to this specific question that is maybe more pertinent to this water week and water workshop. As you think about yourself and whether it's a personal practice on how to start building this place-based sense of time that relates to climate change, so that you can localize climate change, or if you're gonna be encouraging other folks to do that, how would you think about integrating water into an ecocultural calendar? And again, you can put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself if you want. I see ice off. That's a great one. And there's long-term data records too that can connect to that. So if you have a nearby source of water that you can kind of check out and connect to, even if there's not long-term records on that individual lake, it starts building that connection and that observation. I have some friends that do an annual competition for ice off, and the winner gets like a pretty ridiculous fish trophy. So there's ways to kind of think about that in a fun way. I see aquatic plant emergence and flowering. So that's connected to water in the sense that those are water-based plants. Scott, did you want to say anything more on that at all? And no pressure if not. You can totally jump in and not.
Pointing it out, like phenology for plants on land. You could watch for the same things in the water.
Yeah,
good to snorkel.
Yeah, well, and I wonder too, like a lot of the things that people are noticing seasonally is that there's bigger fluctuations in water levels. And so I wonder if looking at those aquatic plants would tell us some important stuff about that. All right, I'm just going to read a bunch that are in the chat, and then people can feel free to unmute themselves if they want to talk more, and I'll give you like a little bit, so there'll be an awkward pause to do that, but you can totally just pass on that. So water presence levels in ephemeral streams. All right, that's a cool one. I think especially the ephemeral streams with that kind of weirdo weather patterning going on is a good one. And flooded sideways and sidewalks. I mean, flooded sidewalks. I didn't read that before I read it out loud. Yeah, and flooding is definitely something that is happening more and more frequently. Especially lately, I was we had a fire person present recently, and I was like, how do you think climate change is going to affect your fire job? And we often think climate change, hot, fire. And she's like, well, we've actually been in a pretty wet cycle recently, but those cycles are changing. And so thinking about tracking those cycles. All right, arrival of water birds, loons, pelicans, mergansers. I love mergansers and their little spiky thing. Fish spawning, different fish spawning times, hatch out with invertebrates. Wow, Emma is listening to ice melting right now, which is one of the coolest sounds. So I'm a little jealous. And yeah, thinking of all the different senses that you can use when we're thinking about our experiences and our felt experiences with the world, and how to build and amplify those connections and keep track of them. And then we have nitrate levels in water corresponding with spraying fertilizers and rain events. So definitely with some of those large scale system practices and what that means for watersheds, and even thinking about, large scale rain events. We have frog calls, ice booming. That's another fun one. Cool, so lots of awesome ideas. Just looking at water down the street and running it down the drain, like knowing where your water comes from and where it goes is a pretty cool way to connect to different place and climate stuff that's going on. I got to do this one tour that did that in the Twin Cities, and it was so fun. It was with like, I don't know, 5 to 10-year-olds, I'd say, and we got to explore that very journey, and from it falling on the ground to going to the water plant, and it's super cool, and you can just even do that right down your street. All right, cool. So it's about 2:50 now. And let me see if there's anything else that I missed. I don't think so. So that's my contact information. And I kind of gave you lots of different ideas, and it was not a super duper concrete product, but I just want to say thanks for listening. And if you do end up doing more with this kind of idea of ecocultural calendars and how to keep track of time and relate it to climate change in your own place, I'd be super curious to learn more about that. And if you have more questions now, we still have about 10 minutes or so, though I maybe need some breaks. So you can throw them in the chat, or you can ask them out loud. I see Emma is, I'm also thinking of overall ecocultural calendars and what painted over elements I may include and potentially personal, emotional, spiritual reactions to the different times of year. Okay, cool. So there's a couple different layers as you might call them in that. But yeah, those like felt emotions, so that climate change is something real and not abstract, is pretty important. And really being critical of those painted over elements. And I used a lot of Indigenous context examples, which, you know, kind of Western science history does a good job of excluding lots of different people, not just Indigenous people, which it's getting better, but that's a whole nother rant. But there's lots of ways to think about that. So maybe there's like species that are underrepresented, or, you know, a river that used to be in a city in an urban environment, but now it's covered over or put into a tunnel. And what does that mean for animacy? So really interesting ideas to think about.
Kate, I think about the opening of fishing season every year, and how about 20 years ago there was a late spring and fishing season opened and there was still ice on the lakes. And then 10 years later, you're out there fishing on opening fishing season and it's 70 degrees. So it can really vary. And there's also one year where it snowed about 6 inches. So it's a lot of difference in the variation on how early spring comes every year.
Yeah, and those like stories that are based on your activities and what you're doing outside are super duper powerful. In that Walpuri context, it was a lot of like subsistence-based activities and when food is available. And you're talking in a fishing context, which could be subsistence or recreation. But if you think about how that's impacting you and your activity, it's kind of like, wow, how are you doing there, fish? And I know, well, depending on where you're fishing, there's like trout are pretty, you know, having some trouble with warming waters and things like that. And yeah, so connecting those activities to what's going on is awesome idea. Thanks for sharing.
Well, we were fishing where a river comes into a lake and it was open for maybe 100 yards. And in that football-sized field of open water, there was 24 loons and 2 otters. So it was quite
cool. Yeah, and loons are another kind of interesting species in Minnesota. They were, it's the state bird, and a lot of people are talking about how the loon is, you know, changing its place where it migrates, and that loons might not be a part of the landscape in 100 years, which that idea of missing species was another kind of powerful thing that like, think of all that activity and yeah, all the stuff that's going on with those changes.
Hi, I just had a question. I was unfortunately had to join late, but I'm curious whether any of the calendars, or you've uncovered anything that's in the spiral form, because I feel like there's these cycles, but now we have this dimension of unidirectional change. Though things aren't the same as they've always been. So how do you, that's just an interesting idea to have both the linearity of change
the 3D
and the cycles at the same time.
Yeah, no, I think that would be super interesting. And I mean, that would be super fun. You could build it in a 3D actual model, and I'm sure there's a lot of virtual platforms that could do such a thing. I do know one of my good friends, Jeff Greeno, or Pemapame, he talks a lot about Indigenous time. He's Menominee and does a lot of work in the forest. And he talks about that Indigenous time in that circle, but also in terms of cycles, and that circle where in the north, it's like the kind of closing down time, which is winter. This is a really poor translation, so don't quote me on any of these things. And then the east is kind of the awakening time. And then the south is like, you know, middle-aged adult. And then the west is like the getting old time in human terms, but all land cycles are having those similar phenomenon of points in time. And I found that useful to think about cycles on whatever scale you're talking about. And I think you're getting to that sometime with that 3D model, because you could make it confusing, but I think that's a super cool idea.
Well, right, and then the idea of generations, right? The 7 generations, that is a cycle potentially too, and there's a lot of concern that we're reaching the end of some kind of cycle, but then the hope is there's a new cycle maybe beginning that'll be different, right?
Yeah, no, it's a pretty good model for lots of things. I mean, you can think geologic scale, you can think plant scale, you can think related to kind of traditional stories and ways of knowing and how that goes. So yeah, really cool idea. Let me go back to the chat. All right, so we have some folks that are in the driftless curiosity area to deepen those connections to land. And they're hosting workshops on the land each month to connect people to the land in unique ways. Just thinking about ecocultural calendars. And I don't know, Joy, if you wanted to say anything more about that. You've been a pretty good participant, so feel free to say yay or nay to that one.
Yeah, I just really have enjoyed your content today. I think it's really got my mind turning on different ways that I could use this material in our nonprofit. And I like the idea of grounding to place. That's very much part of our mission. And I just love to learn more about how I could teach this to other people and make a workshop, a creative workshop out of it. So thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, and yeah, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm defending my thesis in April and have lots of other things going on. So if I don't get back to you immediately, that's just why, but just goes for anyone. Feel free to connect with me via email or whatever. I just am leaving these awkward pauses. They're really super duper awkward in Zoom. So I'm gonna just babble right now. But, and do a last call for any questions, comments, thoughts, ideas. And I guess, Erin, are you coming on to have a comment, thought, or idea? Otherwise, I'll give a thanks to everyone for bearing to come and sit on the computer screen on such a beautiful day. So hopefully this was worthwhile, and that your little reprieve outside was great. So
I just wanted to say the session was awesome. I'm really fortunate to be here. And I just wanted to remind everybody, my moderating job was very easy because you did everything, Kate, but the day is not over yet. So if you are still interested, we have a short break where you can go on the website and visit. There's like ways to network and visit with exhibitors. And then there's water trivia happening at 3:30. And then there's a closing session, there's a break for dinner, and there is a film screening tonight too. So if you need something to do at 7 o'clock, they're screening Brave Blue World. And I think you can go to the conference page to find out more about that. So that's all I wanted to say.
Cool. Well, thanks again, everyone. And I guess have a good rest of the conference.
Thank you.